end up watching this from like all over the country.
Yeah, you guys are. I didn't realize that you're really, truly national in a way. I mean, I know your membership is Atlanta,
Yeah.
Greater Atlanta, but people in pro bono across the U.S. can tap in. I guess that's the beauty of the web. So.
And some things are so Georgia specific, you know, we try to make it very clear, but some are,
Right.
you know, not.
Totally
so.
applicable. Yeah, that's a good point.
Do you know how I fix that though? Because it's all.
Yeah, so I'm really glad to do this. I've been trying to find other ways that I can do pro bono that's sort of within my experience level.
Yes.
So it's really sad to think I've been a lawyer for so many years and have very few useful skills.
I know the feeling, but I'm sure it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, one day when my kids are gone and I really have more time, I'd like to learn how to do the grandparent adoptions and things like that. But for now, do these go up a little, do you know?
They do.
This
There's
thing
a
on
little,
the right.
yeah.
Oh,
Handle on the
here,
right.
we're gonna see it. Whoop, thanks.
Yeah, I used to do those when I was at a law firm.
There's something, it doesn't have to be that, but
Yeah,
something
but
that's
I
really
love
more
those.
hands-on, helping people who
Yeah.
can't pay for legal services, that would be.
Well, I may be sitting up really high because now I can't get it. I have to get it back down. Well, there we go.
Yeah.
I just have to sit in it.
And so will you keep me on track for time?
Do you want a signal or something?
I just don't wanna go, I can keep my watch here too. So we start at 10, right?
Yes.
And then we go to about 10:45 and then questions if there are any.
I might ask you to move your water to the side if that's
Okay,
okay.
yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, tell me where the line of sight is and I can put,
Yeah.
and I'll take this out of the way too.
Or you won't be able to see that if that's on the table, but the glass is just a little too high.
Good morning, and welcome to the monthly webcast presented by the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. We want to begin by thanking Georgia Legal Services for hosting this webcast and making it available on its website. The information provided during this webcast does not constitute specific legal advice and is for informational purposes only. My name is Robin Sangston, and I'm the Vice President of Legal Affairs for Cox Communications, and I will be talking today about how to plan for and run an effective nonprofit board meeting. On slide 2, we have the mission of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, which is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We match eligible organizations with volunteer lawyers from the leading corporations and law firms in Atlanta who can assist nonprofits with their business law matters. The eligibility and other information regarding the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is on slide 3. In order to be a client, an organization must be a 501c3 nonprofit, must be located in or serve the greater Atlanta area, must serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals, and must be unable to afford legal services. You can get more information on the website at www.pbpatl.org. And other upcoming webinars and workshops will be on the workshops page on their website. So turning to the substance of our program today, before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts about hosting a board meeting, you have to think about the philosophy of your board. Is your board really more of a fundraising board, or is your board supposed to be more of a strategic and working board? And that will really inform a lot of these other things we're going to talk about this morning. In the last 5 or 6 years, board governance has really undergone a large transformation because many boards of the past were more fundraising boards or more information download boards, where board members would come together to get information about the organization and to work on fundraising for the organization, but not so much to roll up their sleeves and do the heavy lifting of the organization. So the board meetings in the former category were really one-way downloads of information where staff or the executive committee would come prepared to educate the board members about what the board had been doing, but not so much to solicit a lot of information and ideas. As I mentioned, in the last 5 or 6 years, that transformation has occurred where boards now really want to be more engaged in setting the strategy of the organization and doing more of the work of the organization. And as a result, board meetings tend to have more of a feel of a two-way dialogue. And to have a board meeting where you really want to have a two-way dialogue, you prepare for it very differently. I think now most boards have sort of settled on a hybrid model where there is some download of information from staff or from the committees, but then a significant percentage of the meeting is reserved for having discussion, dialogue, and information sharing and ideas to really inform the strategic direction of the organization. Another thing you want to think about up front too is, are your board meetings going to be in person, or are you going to allow participation by telephone? I think probably because we're talking about boards in the greater Atlanta area, hopefully you all have the capability of having board meetings in person. But I've served on a lot of boards where there are participants by telephone, and I can tell you that those usually are not as effective. You have people having difficulty with dialing in. You have people more easily distracted. You all know when you're dialing in for a call, it's easy to multitask if people don't know what you're doing. So I think if you're really striving to have the kind of board meeting that I would recommend, which is the hybrid model, you want to encourage all of your board members to participate in person, which means you have to make sure that that happens. Again, you can set some of that up in your bylaws as well by making it a requirement that your members attend a certain number of meetings in person. But if you have that as a requirement, of course, then you have to be willing to enforce it, which raises other political issues. But again, I highly recommend that you try to have meetings where all board members attend in person and make it the exception, not the rule, where you allow some sort of a dialing in, calling in capability. So how do you prepare to have an effective board meeting? And I'm going to talk really more toward this hybrid model that I mentioned earlier. One of the first things you need to think about as either staff or the chair of the board is preparing your agenda. This is a very, very critical portion of your preparations. Without a good, solid agenda, the meeting can tend to run off track. You're not going to get a lot done, and you're going to have board member frustration. Again, one of the things you really want to be thinking about as someone who's either the staff in charge of the organization or the chair is keeping your board members engaged. You want to have a high level of engagement, and to do that, you do need strong, well-developed, well-crafted agendas, and you need to stick to them to keep your board members engaged in the meeting and feeling productive. Again, with your organizations, my sense would be that people are volunteering because they really care passionately about what you're doing. They want to be involved and they want to make a difference. I have been on some other types of boards where the board is really more of a social networking kind of opportunity. So there, people come together for networking purposes, not so much because, again, they feel passionately about wanting to get a lot accomplished. But I think you all are running the types of organizations where your board members are really wanting to come and get things done. And so you're going to start that off and ensure that happens by having a good, solid agenda. So before your meeting, you need to go and solicit some feedback from the staff, from the executive committee, and then from some board members possibly. And if you have working committees, from the working committees, so you can start crafting your agenda. You want to prepare it very carefully. You want to be thoughtful. Typically, you'll follow a constant format from meeting to meeting, again, to provide consistency. It's more comfortable for board members to know that the agenda is going to follow a certain format, so don't wildly change it from meeting to meeting. Some things may drop off or not be raised at different meetings depending on what the work is that needs to get done, but try to be fairly consistent in your format, and there are a lot of formats that you can pull up online. Once you develop that agenda, you want to make sure you get it out there well in advance of the meeting, either by email or by sending it in a board book, but it's not sufficient to supply it the day of the meeting, if at all possible. You really want to make sure that people have more than 24 hours in advance to familiarize themselves with the agenda. But then, of course, there are always people who won't have time to read it, leave it, back at the office. So make sure you have copies in the meeting as well. Be prepared to have the minutes ready to be voted on at the board meeting, which again means that they have to be prepared in advance of the meeting and circulated so that people can come to the meeting ready to make any additions or corrections or amendments, and that the minutes can be approved at your meeting in person, which is usually a requirement of your governance. And then other materials you need to be thoughtful about as well. If staff is going to present reports on the work that they've been doing, those should follow a similar format, and they should be included in the materials that you provide at the meeting. If committees have been doing work and they have written materials, those should be prepared in advance and provided well in advance of the meeting, if at all possible, but certainly at the meeting. And then if you're following sort of this hybrid model that I was talking about, where you reserve a portion of your board meeting for discussion and development of strategy, you may want to include some thought papers or white papers or pieces that talk about some of the more interesting and challenging issues that you're dealing with. You might want to get that written material out to your board members in advance so they can come prepared to the meeting. So running the meeting, that's really your job if you are the executive director or if you are the chairman of the board, is to run the meeting. You are in charge. Depending on how established your staff is and how many resources you have, your staff may play a greater or lesser role in that. But if you're a fairly underfunded, unfortunately, nonprofit without a lot of staff to help you, then as the chair, it's really your responsibility to make sure that the meeting is run and is effective. And again, you're trying to provide a meaningful experience for your board members so you can keep them engaged, keep them wanting to come back, make them feel that they're actually doing good and that you're accomplishing the mission and the purpose of your organization. So the very first thing, it's absolutely critical, is to call the meeting to order on time. It seems like a silly, trivial point, but I have been to meetings where 15 minutes in, people are still chit-chatting in the hall, they haven't taken their seat. That's not a professional way to run your organization. If you, and you will always have people who want to do the networking and the catching up and the chit-chat, then you should build in some time prior to the meeting, whether it's coffee hour with a start and an ending time, or it's a luncheon with a start and an ending time, but let everybody know that that's the time that they're to do their social interaction, and then you're going to start on time. So call your meeting to order and get it on the record, and have your secretary reflect that the meeting started on time. Make introductions. Again, depending on how big your organization is, if it's a small organization, everybody may know everybody very, very well. But if it's a larger board, you're going to have board members who come in and out infrequently. It's awkward to be sitting in a board meeting and realize that you don't know the name of the person sitting next to you. So take time to go around the table. Make sure you give ample opportunity to introduce and recognize staff as well. Again, in the boards that I've participated in, staff does yeoman's labor. They're really critical to the health and the success of the organization. They are underpaid. Give them recognition for all that they do. I would recommend that you introduce all staff who are present. If you have interns, part-time, volunteers, people like that, to recognize them as well. So do reserve a little time for introductions. I think it's a nice way to make everybody feel that they know each other and they're comfortable. And then typically you'll move into reading and approving the minutes, giving opportunity for board members to make substantive changes, additions, corrections. Oftentimes the minutes will say that somebody wasn't at the meeting and they actually were at the meeting, and you'll want to correct that to reflect that they were in attendance. Then oftentimes you'll move into the old business portion of the meeting. This is where you'll cover matters that have been raised at prior board meetings where staff or committees or the executive committee were off doing the work of the board, and you'll want to cover what has been accomplished. This is where, if you do have standing committees, you'll want to include your committee reports, and you may want a representative to review what work the committees have been doing as well. Allowing ample opportunity for board members to ask questions of those present. This is not a significant, this is where I talk about sort of the fairly one-way informational download of information. This is not supposed to be a big debate about what's been going on, but really more making sure that everyone's up to speed on the work of the organization and feels comfortable that the fiduciary duties are being carried out with respect to the organization. Then the next portion of your meeting is where you're going to have sort of the big meaty discussions, and this you should reserve a fairly significant portion of time to discuss new business. These are the maybe challenges that the organization is facing that you need to grapple with. If your fundraising efforts aren't as successful and you're trying to figure out how to rectify that. If you have a major event upcoming that's very, very important, that it be just right, and you have a lot of issues that are open for discussion or need feedback from the board on how to make it effective, this is where you want to reserve time. I served on a board that was about promoting diversity in my industry, and the industry was changing dramatically in terms of the demographics of folks coming into the industry, in terms of consolidation of the members of the industry, and we were really struggling with how to continue to promote the advancement of women and minorities in this very dynamic and changing environment. So we would spend a portion of the new business section of our meetings getting educated about projections for what the industry was going to look like, what the demographics were going to look like, and trying to figure out how we could really meet the needs of all of our constituencies. So this was the really good hard work of the board meeting, and you want to save ample time for that. As the chair, though, this is also a more challenging time for you as a leader of the board meeting. When you're simply reviewing old business or you're going through committee reports, that's fairly simple to have those read or presented as pretty much one-way downloads of information. When you're having open dialogue and debate and discussion, that's where you have to really bring your good skills in terms of active listening, encouraging participation, making sure that everybody is heard, using your high emotional intelligence to notice that one of your board members may be off sort of drumming their fingers and looking down and looking frustrated, and making sure that you invite that person to chime in and give their opinion. Managing airtime, you will always have some board members who tend to dominate the discussion. You have to politely but firmly close that out at the appropriate time to allow opportunity for others to participate as well. So the new business section is a trickier part of your leadership role, but one that's very important because, again, it's where you can kind of get derailed, and board members can come away with the feeling of frustration that somebody talks too much, or I never get heard, or the board chair isn't really directing the discussion in a way that's productive. So be very thoughtful about that, and figure out ahead of time how you're going to navigate through what can be a sensitive political role for you. The financials need to be presented at every board meeting, and it's up to you when and where you want to do that. Typically, the treasurer will do a presentation. Again, it's nice if you can have the financial information provided to the board members in advance. Not necessary. I've found that a lot of board members aren't terribly comfortable reviewing balance sheets and financial documents. So I think it's really okay to walk them through it at the board meeting at a fairly detailed level of information so that they can ask questions as they're reviewing it with the treasurer. But obviously a critical portion of your board meeting to make sure that everyone's comfortable with the financial position of the organization. And I would mention that when you're thinking about your treasurer, oftentimes it's just somebody who sort of lands in that spot as they're moving up the organization, and you may want to see if you can, within the flexibility of your bylaws, select someone to be treasurer who actually has some financial acumen. It will make it a much more rich and robust discussion if you have a treasurer who really understands the financials. So be thoughtful about that if at all. If you have the bench strength where you really have someone with some financial acumen, I would encourage that you try to have that person be the treasurer, even if it means that you have to do some juggling in terms of your succession planning. I've even seen situations where we've had treasurers who serve 2 terms because they are very good at what they're doing, and then they leapfrog over another position to move up in the succession planning. And then you want to save some time at the end of the meeting for other discussion that you might not have anticipated. Things may come up. A board member may be sitting there and just remembering that there was something that they wanted to report on. So leave some time at the end of your meeting, and then make sure that you close on time. Board meetings typically should never go more than 3 hours. That's pretty long, and you need some breaks in there as well. And so if you set your meeting from 9 to 12, make sure you start at 9 and you end at 12. If you know you're going to be doing a session where you really are going to be doing a lot of strategic planning for the organization, you may want to do it over 2 days. You may want to break it up somehow. But after 3 meetings, people's brains are pretty fried, and so I don't recommend you go much longer than that, or you're not going to really have the level of engagement and participation that you want. And then some, depending on whether you do have a staff, some boards will want to move into an executive session where staff leaves the room and you cover items that may have to do with staff comp, staff reviews, or perhaps other sensitive issues around nominations and other matters where you want to have a closed-door session. If you're going to do an executive session, you should put that on your agenda so that board members know they're expected to stay and participate in that. Those are usually fairly brief, but you want to make sure that there's notice that that's going to be occurring. So moving on to slide 7, I'm just going to touch very briefly on the sunshine laws because then I have to disclaim up front that I'm not an expert on them. I have not served on any boards that involve the sunshine laws, but I did want to mention it because there may be those of you out there who do receive some public funding, and if you do receive public funding of about, I think in Georgia the rule is 1/3 of your funding comes from public sources, then you are subject to the sunshine laws. And I don't know if there's anyone on the line who's from out of state, but the sunshine laws do vary from state to state, so you'll want to make sure that you've checked the sunshine laws in your particular state. But I've got the reference on slide 7 to the statutory provisions for the Georgia code. I would imagine that the Pro Bono Partnership could do a whole webinar on the sunshine laws, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of things so you'll have that top of mind and know that if you do receive 1/3 of your funding from public sources in Georgia, that you do need to become familiar with the sunshine laws, and you should make sure that you see an attorney or touch base with the Pro Bono Partnership and get some special training around what those rules mean for you and your organization. But there's really 2 primary requirements. If you are subject to the sunshine laws, you need to have open meetings and you need to follow the open records requirements. The open meeting requirement means that it applies if you're going to have a quorum of members present and discuss public business, in which event then you would need to give advance notice of the meeting with specific time, date, and place so that members of the public can participate and attend if they so choose. I was doing just a quick survey of the research yesterday, and it looks like there's a lot of debate out there whether notice on a website or internet notice is adequate, so you may want to make sure that you're giving adequate notice so you wouldn't be challenged later on not having given adequate notice if it's by some kind of online mechanism. And then the other requirement is that you're subject to an open records requirement, which means that your documents that are prepared in the ordinary course of the board may be subject to written request, and then you have a 3-day obligation to produce them. There's a lot of detail around these 2 basic requirements, so again, I encourage you to make sure that you've spoken to somebody who's well-versed in the sunshine laws for your state if you are subject to them. Okay, going back to talk just a little bit about the documents for your board meeting. We've touched on some of this, but I wanted to go through them with a little more information. The board book is the first thing I wanted to mention. Again, it depends on how thinly or leanly you are organized and whether you do have a staff that's able to help you. But I find that board books provided in advance are a wonderful resource for the board members to have. It compiles all the necessary documents for the board meeting in one place. If you get it in advance of the meeting, then you have an opportunity to be very knowledgeable about what's going to happen during the board meeting, and you're organized and stay on track. It also tends to make your board meetings more substantive because you can include a lot of materials in your board book that you aren't necessarily going to cover, but they're there for informational purposes for the board member to take a look at what's been happening during the last period of time from the last board meeting. Excuse me. I also like the board book because you can often include the agenda up on the front cover, so that's a handy reference for your board members to keep track of what's going to happen during the course of the board meeting. And you can put other reference material in there. The minutes can be in there. Your financials can be in there. This is where you can include staff reports. Again, if there are staff reports that staff is not going to necessarily present on during the board meeting, you can have them included there as a reference material. This is where you can have your committee reports. This is where you can include white papers if they're thought papers about what research is going on in your area of expertise, if it's around laws that pertain to the work that you do, if it's around the fundraising environment, if it's around regulation, things like that. You can include all of that in the board book. This is a nice place where you, if your organization has received any press hasn't done any press releases or has had any media coverage. You can compile all of that for your board members. It gives them a good positive feeling around the recognition that your organization is getting, and it compiles it all in one place. And it's also a really good place to include board of director contact information. So again, if you have a fairly large board and not all the board members know each other, it's a nice handy desk reference to have their name, their title, their affiliations, email, phone number, so the board members can reach out to each other in the time periods between board meetings. Roles and responsibilities. Just wanted to talk a little bit about what your officers are required to do and staff during your board meeting. Again, this will vary depending on how big your organization is, how large your staff is. But the chair is, as I said, is responsible for leading the meeting, setting the tone, setting the agenda, and then making sure that all board members are heard and feel like they are able to participate in the process. If you have a vice chair or incoming chair, that person typically will serve in lieu of the chair if the chair is not able to attend the meeting. Your secretary should take notes throughout the board meeting in order to prepare the minutes. And then once the meeting is over, should, as quickly as possible, produce a draft of the minutes for circulation while everyone's memories are fresh. But certainly before the next board meeting, the secretary should circulate the minutes so that at that next board meeting, the minutes can be reviewed and amended if necessary and approved. Your treasurer, as I mentioned, should be able to present the financials, preferably be able to walk the board through them with some level of detail, which may require that the treasurer work with, if you have a staff member who's assigned to the financials, the treasurer may need to be briefed in advance of the board meeting on the financials. I highly recommend that if your treasurer is not as comfortable with financial documents, that the treasurer set some time aside with the staff person who maintains the finances of the organization to get up to speed on that. And then the staff member should probably be present at the meeting if there are questions that the treasurer is not able to answer. And then various members of the staff should participate during the meeting as needed, depending on their role. If you have a lot of programming that your organization produces during the course of the year, you probably have a staff member who's devoted to programming who may want to give a report on the programs that have been held in the last period of time and then the upcoming programs. Again, you might want the staff member who's in charge of fundraising to speak about fundraising and how the fundraising efforts are tracking for the year. Depending on how large your organization is, you may have a staff member who is responsible for sort of governance and legal issues that arise, and that person would be an invaluable resource to include in the meeting as well. Follow-up. You want to make sure that after the meeting that as the chair, you're working closely with staff to ensure that you continue to act on items that have come up as open items for further discussion or for further action by the board, by the executive committee, or by committees. So you want to fairly quickly reduce your thoughts to writing and make sure that you've communicated with committee chairs, that with appropriate staff people, with any other individuals you need to communicate with about what the follow-up items are. You don't want to lose track and then show up at the next meeting and realize that there's old business that hasn't been attended to. This will lead to a high degree of frustration on the part of board members who feel that nothing's been accomplished from meeting to meeting. We've talked a bit about how the minutes need to be in process from meeting to meeting. You may move into an executive committee session after your board meeting where the executive committee will work on carrying forward tactical decisions that need to be made as an outflow from the decisions that the board made at the board meeting, and you want to schedule your executive committee meeting in fairly short order. That can be telephonic. Typically, I don't think you need to do that in person, but you want to make sure that your executive committee is moving the work of the board forward. And then depending on how big your board is, you may want to have various committees, whether they're standing or ad hoc, working in between board meetings and prepared to give a report at the next board meeting on what they've been doing. I should touch base on ad hoc. Your board in your governance documents may have certain standing committees. Often you'll have a finance committee, you'll have a fundraising committee, you may have an advocacy committee depending on the work of your organization. You may have a programming committee, although typically programming is handled by staff, but again, depending on the size of your organization, you may have board members and committee members who do work on programming. I'm trying to think of other types of committees that you have. I've seen marketing committees. Again, I don't think marketing committees are typically very effective if you are in a position where you can have staff who handles marketing. It's probably better to have a full-time expert, or at least part-time expert dedicated to marketing, rather than having board members who have day jobs trying to do the marketing of the organization. But in any event, you'll probably have some standing committees, and you'll want to be touching base with them following your board meeting to make sure that they know what action items they have to work on from the direction of the board. But during your board meeting, you may end up creating or finding that you have the need for an ad hoc committee to be formed. And if so, consistent with your bylaws, you may be able to constitute an ad hoc committee. I know that some boards will have nominations be a standing committee, but sometimes nominations will be taken up as an ad hoc committee. There may be some particular issue that your organization is dealing with that you just didn't have time to address during your 3 or 2 hour board meeting that you want to take offline and formulate an ad hoc committee. I know that on one board that I participated on fairly extensively, we have been dealing with challenges around finding new board members that are sort of outside of the typical places where we solicit them from. We're trying to broaden the pool. We're trying to have more diversity on the board. We're trying to have generational diversity, for example. So we've created an ad hoc committee to really look at that issue in more depth and make recommendations back to the board on how we might want to tweak our bylaws to change the constitution of the board to allow for a seat that might be dedicated more toward a Gen X or Gen Y individual, because much of our board is baby boomers. So you may have the opportunity or need to create an ad hoc committee, and you'll want to make sure that gets constituted straight away and that they are busily at work so that they can give a report back to the next board meeting on what they've been doing in the meantime. So some do's and don'ts here. I guess I could call these some of my pet peeves and some of my good things to do that will make your board members very happy if you remember to do them. I can't reiterate this first one enough. Again, start on time, be punctual. These board meetings should not be treated any differently than you would handle a meeting in your corporation or your job in terms of professionalism and punctuality. Keep the meeting on track. Don't let the dialogue and the discourse spiral out of control. I've seen instances where board members, again, try to dominate the conversation or can take everybody off agenda. Make sure you keep the meeting on track, on focus, and consistent with the agenda. Do stimulate debate, though. There's nothing worse than coming and taking 3 hours out of your day during your work day or at night to go to a board meeting and to sit there and have really no discussion, no debate, and have it be a mere presentation of information which you probably could have just read in the board book. So make sure that you ask probing questions, make sure that you get everybody to participate to the extent they want, and keep the debate lively and productive. Follow your bylaws. As the board chair, do your homework, make sure you're familiar with them. If there are finer points, hopefully you'll have somebody on staff who's very familiar with them who can check questions as they come up. But be sure that you know how many board members need to be present so that you have a quorum. Be sure that you understand what the voting requirements are in your governance documents, and that you're able to answer questions or have somebody present who can answer questions if questions arise. That can really stall a board meeting if somebody asks a question about the bylaws or the governing documents and nobody knows the answer, and then you aren't able to move the meeting forward. Do your preparation. All of the things that we talked about should be done well in advance of the board meeting, just like you would come prepared to any other organizational meeting in your professional nonprofit life. Make sure that you, as the chair, are prepared. One thing you may want to consider doing is having a chat, a conference call with the executive director of the organization, not just about setting the agenda, but about any other areas of information that you want to be informed on before your meeting. follow the basics of parliamentary procedure. I don't think you need to get too hung up on those. I think the parliamentary procedural rules have, or the approach to them have relaxed a bit over the years, but still you need to ask for the approval of the minutes in an appropriate manner. You need to conduct your voting in an appropriate manner. So brush up a little bit on parliamentary rules of procedure. There are online sites where you can go and get the basics of that. And as the chair, you'll be expected to walk the board members through that. And again, recognize your volunteers, all of the board members, and also recognize your staff liberally at the beginning of the meeting, and then as you close the meeting, it's very nice to recognize and extend your appreciation to the hard efforts and the time that all of these people are devoting to the success of the organization. You can never recognize people too much, I believe. On the negative side, some of my pet peeves: don't be late, don't overschedule. Some of us high achievers think that we can accomplish all of these things during the course of a 3-hour board meeting, and you can get a crammed agenda that is clearly overpacked, and you're going to end up with a problem because you're not going to get through all the material. You're going to get hung up, and then you're either going to be faced with the possibility of running late, which I told you can't do, so you can't run long, or not getting to everything, which would not be good. What you need to do if you find that either rightly or wrongly you've overscheduled the meeting is take things offline for further discussion if you're getting bogged down, either by setting up an ad hoc committee or having a follow-up conference call on a particular topic. But you really need to make sure you get through the agenda and you finish on time. Don't let the debate run too long, and don't let individuals dominate the conversation. You'll very quickly get a feel for the personalities and the styles of the individual board members. It is very predictable at times which ones are going to want to take up a lot of airtime, which ones are going to want to take the devil's advocate. Certainly some of that is appropriate, but you have to play traffic cop, and you have to make sure that everyone feels like they're having an opportunity to contribute. So don't let the debate run too long, and don't let certain individuals dominate the discussion. Don't deviate from the agenda. If something comes up during the meeting that you have overlooked, either table it till the end of the meeting when you have some time set aside for discussion of other items. But don't go off on a tangent in the middle of the meeting on something that gets raised mid-meeting. Say, we'll take that up at the end if we have time, and if we don't have time, take it up offline later in a separate conference call specifically for that purpose, or assign it out to one of your committees if you have a standing committee that can address it, or establish an ad hoc committee. And then set your time limits, not just for the start of the meeting and the close of the meeting, but I like to try to assign specific time periods for each step of the agenda. So you may have 5 minutes for the welcome, for example, where you welcome everybody, you facilitate introductions. You may have 5 minutes for review of the minutes and amendments to the minutes. Then you'll want to figure out, depending on how long your board meeting is, how much time you want to allow to the old business section, to committee reports. And then I think you want to save the bulk of your time to the new business, where you're going to have the robust and rich, hopefully, discussion about the new business of the organization. So I'll try to allow the bulk of your time, for that portion of the meeting, and then have some period of time for your other items that you may need to address that get raised during the meeting that you hadn't anticipated. You need your period of time for your financials, of course, and then you want to have some time for your close. And then if you do go into executive session, you want to have a specific period of time after the close of the formal meeting, after the formal meeting has adjourned, to whatever period of time that you think you'll need to be in executive session, and you want to specify for that. We have a question.
Yes. One person wants to know if it's better to publish your time estimates in your agenda or just have it in mind.
The question is it better to publish your time minutes or have it in mind? And I would recommend that you have the time limits published in the agenda, so the board understands sort of where the time is being allocated by the chair, recognizing that you may feel unsure about how accurate you're going to be the first time you do this. but I think you'll get pretty good at it after one meeting. And I think everyone will understand that this is a range. It's not necessarily 5 minutes and then we're going to stop talking about it, but you're just trying to keep it moving along and keep people's expectations set. So I would recommend that out on the side of your agenda that you have an assigned period of time if you want to say 5 minutes or you want to say 5 to 10 minutes. And I also probably didn't mention this, you should definitely build in some breaks. If you're going to have a 3-hour board meeting, you need a couple of personal breaks built in as well, and so you should have those specified in your agenda when you're anticipating taking a break. Recognizing that sometimes something will go a little long and you might have to use the break time period to complete the section that you were working on, and then maybe you try to build your break back in somewhere else in the agenda. One of the other, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else about setting your time limits and building in the breaks. The importance of having the break is that otherwise you're going to have this phenomenon that I know you don't want, where board members start randomly getting up from the meeting and going out of the room to either check their Blackberries or to use the facilities or to get coffee or whatever. So if they know that you have set breaks built into your meeting, then it's more likely that they're going to use those time periods for those sort of personal functions that need to be taken care of and not be getting up and leaving the meeting, which you definitely want to discourage a lot of coming and going. It's distracting, and then you can end up in a situation where you're trying to bring something to a vote and somebody isn't in the room. So definitely make sure that you have some breaks built in there, probably 5 minutes per hour.
Can you speak a minute about executive session, and should you have it at every meeting, and what should happen?
Question about executive session, and should you have it at every meeting, and what should happen at the meeting? No, these are not something that you would regularly schedule. It wouldn't be part of your regular agenda. This is more of an ad hoc occurrence when frequently this will happen toward the end of your year when you're talking about staff compensation, staff reviews, executive director compensation, executive director review. You may have, again, depending on your organization, and I know there's some that are very small and don't have the luxury of having paid staff, but if you have paid staff, you may have and be in the luxury of having bonuses and things like that. You don't want staff to be present for those kinds of discussions, so you would want to have an executive session where the board can talk about personnel matters with respect to staff. If you're bored, and I have been on boards where there's a lot of change and upheaval going on, perhaps your executive director has gone or has announced that they're leaving, you would want to have an executive session to talk about your search that you're going to be undertaking for a new executive director or one of the more senior members of staff. Again, you wouldn't want to do that with staff present. There may be other sensitive, politically sensitive issues that you wouldn't necessarily think it would be appropriate to have staff present for. So in those cases, you would want to schedule a special executive session, and you would want to be somewhat generic about the description in the agenda of what the purpose of the executive session. You might say year-end matters pertaining to staff. You might say recruiting and search, whatever the issue is, but you want to be a little bit sensitive about how you describe that in the agenda. I'm trying to think of other instances I've dealt with executive session, but again, it's not something that you would do every meeting, and it's really something that you, as the chair, would feel would be appropriately discussed when you have board members present to discuss it, so their input is valuable and you want to obtain it, but you wouldn't want necessarily to have staff present for it. Okay, so that is the end of my formal presentation. I don't know if you have any questions. Oh, we have a question.
A couple questions. One viewer wants to know, as a small startup, how many board members would you recommend, and also how do you find good board members? Where do you look?
Oh, those are very good questions. As a small startup, how many board members would I recommend, and where do you find good board members? These are very good questions and could take a lot of discussion, but I'll give it my best stab. Number of board members, clearly there are pluses and minuses of having less or more, and you really have to figure out what your philosophy is. With a smaller, more intimate board, it's more likely that you're going to be able to recruit people who are going to be 100% dedicated to the mission and the vision, and they're all going to come knowing that they're expected to roll up their sleeves and probably do a lot of heavy lifting. You're going to be very, very tightly knit. You're going to build trust and a relationship very quickly, and it's going to be probably a very high-performing group of individuals, or hopefully it will. Always exceptions, but so the pluses are you can have a very positive experience. You can get a lot done quickly because you're all working together, firing like on the same cylinder. The downside, of course, is then you're so lean that if somebody can't participate, if you end up making a mistake and selecting someone who just doesn't really work out, or whatever reason in good faith can't contribute, you can find yourself in a real lurch and have a shortage of manpower and not be able to move the board along. So there is a delicate balance. I would aim for having a couple, 2 or 3 more than you really think you need, just for those emergency situations when people drop off. I think 7 is a nice size for that reason. Again, not knowing a lot about what your mission is and what you're trying to accomplish, and assuming that you can tap into volunteers who will come to events and will help you sort of on an ad hoc basis. But 7 is probably a good number, because assuming that 2 aren't going to make it, or 2 may fall off, you've still got 5, which gives you your chair, gives you your vice chair, gives you your secretary, gives you your treasurer, and gives you one other for whatever thing you need, whether it's programming or it's advocacy or some other role, nominations or governance, or some other role that you feel that you need at every meeting. And then you'll have 2 other board members who hopefully will come and participate. So 7's nice. Also probably will help you with your voting, depending on how you decide to set up your quorum. But if you have 7, again, if it's you need 4 to be there, then that's probably doable for most board meetings, so that you don't have to cancel board meetings. On the other hand, if you're a board that is really principally dedicated to fundraising, and I'm not sure how many of the folks on the phone may be in that category, but a lot of the arts organizations, nonprofit arts organizations I've participated in, at least historically, their boards were principally dedicated to fundraising. So it was really the more the merrier philosophy, frankly, which is great if everyone understands that they're being solicited to serve on the board for the purpose of writing checks. Good, but then if you have people who are participating because they really want to get involved in the strategic direction of the organization, they may find themselves frustrated to come to a meeting with 40 people sitting around a table where they only know half of them and they don't get to talk. And it's a lot of just download of information from meeting to meeting, and it's not as engaged a process. So there, I know that the trend has been for a lot of those types of organizations to downsize their boards. I participated on a board for one of the Atlanta arts organizations, and they used to try to have around 40 board members, and they're down around 21, 22, which was much more workable, and you could have a more engaged board, and you could have more dialogue and debate, which I think is what I'm really highly recommending that you try to do. So for you bigger, newer organizations, I would try never to really go higher than a 21, 22 kind of number of people. And obviously, if you've got that many board members, you really do need some staff to help you do all the work of the preparation for the meeting, communication, generation of documents and things. That's just a much bigger undertaking. But I don't really see ever wanting to go much higher than that sort of a number. It's just going to result in really boring board meetings where board members are going to start dropping off because they don't feel engaged. And where do you find good board members? A lot of it is networking and word of mouth. Once you have the vision and the mission set for your organization, you should be able to target into certain networks that might be supportive of you. I would imagine that starting at the Pro Bono Partnership would be a really great place, because they probably have, if not written down in their head, lists of people they know who are active and want to be involved and want to help. They may be able to recommend people to you. I think a lot of the professional associations are good sources. So lawyers, oftentimes, like myself, enjoy serving on boards. In our professional careers, we don't necessarily get to do the kinds of work that boards do. We don't get to see treasury reports. We don't get to build a strategic plan for an organization necessarily if we're more of a subject matter expert. And so being on a board, besides being personally fulfilling from the standpoint of doing good, can be skills enhancing. So I would reach out to a lot of the lawyers organizations and other professional associations in the Atlanta area, where you may find people who are clamoring at getting leadership opportunities and may not necessarily be getting it in their companies or in their day-to-day jobs, and they might love to have an opportunity to do some good work. One more question?
How do you know when your board needs to vote on something, or when a formal vote is necessary?
The question is, how do you know when the board needs to vote on something or when a formal vote is necessary? And maybe it's a bit of the chicken and the egg, but you should start first looking at your governing documents, because they'll often lay out when you need to vote. You certainly need to vote to approve the minutes. You certainly need to vote to add a person to the board. You usually need to vote on the slate of officers each year. You usually need to vote to approve the budget for the next year. And if you're going to make changes to the financials, you may need to vote on those as well. So I'm thinking of other instances there. But one of the things that you can do, we didn't really talk about it, is if you know there is something that's going to be happening during the board meeting that is going to require a vote. So let's say one of your board members dropped off and you have to nominate and approve the election of a new board member. You would want to have a resolution prepared in advance and include that in your board materials that would say, with the appropriate language, we hereby nominate and approve the election of so-and-so to the board, and then you could have that read during the meeting. Then after there's appropriate discussion, debate, you could call that for a vote. So if there are items that you know are going to be subject to a vote, it's helpful to have those included. And you will also want to address those fairly early in the meeting before you get into the meaty discussion portion of the meeting. But I'm trying to think of other things. But finances, staff change, significant staff changes, board seats. If you're going to amend the bylaws, obviously that needs to be subject to a vote, and there may be requirements around specific voting, how many board members have to approve a change to the bylaws, because that's a fairly significant undertaking.
What about contracts? Is it only above a certain amount, or how do you figure?
The question is whether you need to vote to approve a contract as a board. I typically would think that the executive director of the organization would have some signature authority delegated to the executive director by the board. So depending on the size of your organization and your financial strength, you might say that your executive director can approve contracts up to and including a certain dollar amount. And then above that dollar amount, the executive director would need to present it to the board and bring it to board approval. So then that was a good question. And you could have discussion, if you're very new and you haven't thought about this, you might want to have a board discussion about how high you want to set that approval level for the executive director. And executive directors are going to want their CEOs and presidents, whatever their title is, but they're going to want to know that they have the backing of the board up to a certain level, so they can keep the work of the organization going in between meetings. But they also want the assurance that when certain levels are to be achieved or reached, that the board is going to be weighing in on it. That's a good comfort for your paid staff person as well. So having no further questions, this will conclude our session today. Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.